Welcome to this, the latest in the series of the Transport Technology Forum Fireside Chats. It's a pleasure to be here, and today we're going to be spending a bit of time delving into how the TTF helped the people in the Department for Transport and of course everyone right up to the top, up to the Prime Minister, get a handle on what was really happening on our roads with our traffic, with our non-motorized traffic as well, as we headed into the pandemic back in those days, back in March, where the first lockdown happened. What perhaps we can tell from the data that's continued to be collected over the months since then. And then we're going to have a bit of a conversation about where that leaves us and whether there's long-term learning to be had from the experience here. And I'm pleased today, I'm joined as I look around the screen, by Darren Capes from the Department for Transport, Andy Graham from White Willow. We've got Sean Bulmer from York, and we've got Graham Nichols and Yusuf Majid from Arabs. So one by one, we're going to whiz round. We're going to start with a bit of a discussion about, well, those days back in March. Darren, you probably remember them very clearly. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and all of a sudden, people in the Department for Transport woke up to the fact that we didn't know what was going on. We didn't have the sort of data feed that ministers, the Prime Minister, Dominic Cummings, whoever, were expecting. What was it like waking up to that reality, and how on earth did you respond?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thanks, Steve. Yes, yeah, those heady days when we used to go out and travel on trains and sit in pubs. I vaguely remember those days. Yeah. So yeah, what was it like? Well, I think we came up with a fairly startling realization of just how little data the DFT had. And I think, of course, if we'd ever really thought about it, we would have known, but we didn't. And of course, the DFT has quite a lot of data about how motorways and interurban roads operate. And traditionally, it has it quite a long time after the event, because DFT is interested in long-term planning, it's interested in long-term travel trends. It's not really, well, it most certainly isn't a network operator. It's not really interested in live data. So when the initial call came to collect data, when the initial aspiration came from the Cabinet Office to start to put graphs together that could be shown on a daily basis to show what was happening, it became clear quite quickly that we had very little data that we could do that with. So the first thing that happened was that my colleagues in the data team started to crank up the speed at which they could get data from their existing sources, and that met the challenge quite well in terms of interurban transport. We were able to do that. We were able to get from Highways England, from our own counting network, quite a good understanding of what was happening on the motorways and the interurban roads. But that then threw up the equally startling realization that we had virtually no idea of what happened in our cities. We have no counties in the cities. There are very few motorways in city centres. We had very little understanding of that. So sitting one evening thinking about this, not long after we started this process, I thought, well, given the contacts we have in local authorities and given my understanding of the fact that local authorities generally have more data than they know about, we could have a kind of it would be possible for me to send out a sort of Churchillian email and invoke the images of sewing machine factories being repurposed to build Spitfires. What we needed to do was get some data together, get to the local authorities, understand what data we had, use the capacity we had in the TTF and within ARUP, use their analytic ability to start to pull data together. And we initially thought that would be about getting 3 or 4 useful authorities with data, York being one of them. York here to talk about that later, together to produce some significant statistics around that. Of course, what happened was we actually ended up with lots of data, lots of authorities coming to the table, lots of people bringing data, and we went from, incredibly quickly, in a matter of weeks, we went from nothing to the type of thing we publish every week now, this weekly data set. So yeah, it was quite a startling realization about how little we had, and then it was an equally startling realization about how much we could get if we actually put some effort into it.
And I was going to turn to Andy next, Andy Graham, because it's one thing to put out a call around the network, who's got some data, who can help us out here, but it's quite another when that data starts to come through. And as Darren has said, I think perhaps the willingness of TTS members to help might have come as a surprise, but sometimes surprises can bring quite a tide of work with them. I mean, what was your perspective on that?
Oh yeah, Darren contacted me one morning with his, as he says, Churchillian speech. What did we do during the war, Dad? So we sent out an email with ITS UK and TTF to people that we knew saying, kind of, have you got any data? And we made it fairly clear we wanted data that was, for local authorities, was cycling if possible, was real time, was a set that went back to February so we could have some baseline, and was, if possible, potentially available on API. So several things happened. Firstly, lots of people who have data that's reasonably available, City of York Council is a good example, kind of said, yeah, here's our API within literally hours. So we were up and running. Then there was a second group who had to go and kind of think about getting permissions, or that they were holding data on behalf of suppliers, and they came back within hours and days. Then there was a third group who kind of said, oh, I think we've got some data, but we haven't really got our thoughts about how to distribute it. And they started sending files and stuff to ARAPs, as we'll hear later. And then there was another group who kind of came back and said, I don't have any data, but if you give me £5 million on invent a sensor that in 6 months' time I'll be able to give it to you.
Nice.
Said, thanks very much, guys. So we were very pleased. And I was going to the stage where I was getting a phone call and an email while I was on the phone and emailing somebody saying, thanks very much. So some very long days of just trying to make sure people who got off their bottoms and done something realised that we'd actually appreciate what they'd done. And so we got 70 odd local authorities responded pretty quickly, and not just local authorities, also the suppliers of data, UTC suppliers, industry, who said, I hold data on behalf of Fred. I'm going to ask Fred if I can supply it to you, and then opened up huge amounts of data.
So in that sense, it was really the membership, the cross-sectoral membership of the TTF that enabled those connections to work, that it wasn't just the people who were commissioning, perhaps like Sean, holding the data, but it was other people saying, well, you may or may not realize it, but I've got what these guys are after. Can I share it?
You know, a couple of suppliers said, I've got 20 local authorities. If you can just ask for permission for that data, you can have it. Your API will be opened up. It's very, very good. And like you say, it's both ends of the telescope working together.
Excellent. Well, let's go to another end of the telescope then. Let's go to Sean with a magnificent picture of what York will look like when cars are banned. And it can be used as a racetrack. Sean, I mean, I'm guessing here, not only is there a national call for data and a thirst for understanding what's going on, there must be a lot of local pressure on you from elected members to understand what the lockdown means for the city itself. Was that a pressure on you? Did that affect how you engage with this request?
So, yeah, in some terms it was a pressure that they wanted data of what was happening in the city, how the car parks were being used. Have traffic levels actually dropped, or is it just the perception of them being dropped? So, yeah, we did have a bit of pressure on that, but with the data we have and the data we've supplied, we were able to show that quite quickly, the results of what was going on.
And what was going on?
Well, surprisingly, there was a lot less traffic on the roads, and we showed that. We did obviously have a baseline. That baseline has shown through our reports, and we had a morning peak. Darren and Graham can actually explain on that a bit more, but relatively, traffic reduced quite considerably. We have lots of sensors. Obviously, we have our traffic sensors that are going on all the time, our automated traffic counters. We have our traffic cams, which we use for loop detection, and we use that, and we've managed to put on counting. So that is great use of multiple pieces of equipment. But yeah, the pressure's being able to tell people what's actually happening has been great relief for us as well as our elected members.
And is that pressure still live now? Because here we are, we're roughly halfway through the second lockdown. We're looking down the barrel, we're told, of more restrictions coming in if we want to have Christmas with our families. So is the thirst still there for understanding exactly what's happening in the same way?
Yeah, most definitely. It hasn't dropped at all. Even when restrictions were released, our elected members were wanting to know how traffic levels were increasing, decreasing, how the city was being affected as a whole. Was tourism coming back? Were we getting a few more out of town visitors, or was it still people who were just working in the city?
Okay, thanks, Sean. I think what I'd like to do next is turn to Graham and Youssef, because one of the things that we've always found difficult is every local authority wants a bespoke picture. Everyone wants to collect their own data in their own way, in my experience. And I'm guessing even where there's a single supplier, I think Graham was saying earlier, there might be a common supplier, but no, that doesn't mean the format in which they're supplying data to the local authority is the same. So you're presented with multiple authorities worth of data, all piling in different formats. But what we want is, as always, one nice clean graph with one nice clean line going across it telling us what's happening. So tell us, you two, how on earth did you put it all together?
Absolutely. I think it's a very good point that when all the data started to come in, and the first thing we had to do was obviously try and make some sense as to what we were getting. And I think what we had to do very early on was identify what were the key attributes and the key requirements of the data that we needed for this particular service. You know, this service had to be turned around rapidly, and it had to at least provide a daily stream of data at least a sort of 1 hour aggregation. So we quickly sort of pulled together a set of requirements as to what each data set needed, and then assessed everything we got against those requirements. And to be honest, we had to be quite brutal. If a data set didn't meet those requirements, we had to say, look, thanks a lot for offering data, but in this case, doesn't meet what we need. But for everything else, we tried to take as much of the stuff that met those requirements that we could. And as you mentioned, it's interesting because we did get, say, multiple local authority data sets coming through a single data platform, but that didn't mean that all those data sets were the same in terms of attributes, in terms of how often they were updated. So every single one, regardless of where they were coming from, had to be individually processed then into a sort of common format. So I've kind of jumped ahead. So in terms of what we did was we then took the data sets we could and converted those into a format, a common format across all of them that DFT could use. And we certainly said, as a bare minimum, we want coordinates. We need to know where the data is coming from in terms of the road network. We need to know what the traffic flow is, obviously, and we need to know the time, the hour of day this has been captured against. Other than that, nice to have things like vehicle class. If we could get vehicle class data, we would take it, so we could have a look and see how the different classes were behaving during lockdown. And I think another key one was how easy it was going to be to consume. So again, APIs and data platforms are nice and easy, but there were a large number of local authorities out there who really, I guess, at no benefit to themselves, have spent the last 8 months really working hard to send us data every day in a CSV format. And it could be you've got a nice automated database process behind it, pumping that out, or you've got somebody who's actually producing it. I think when we talk about the long term and the long-term sustainability, that might be something that we say, look, how can we improve that? But certainly for this service over the last 8 months, that's been vital. I think we have to say thank you to the people who've been doing that.
Can I just, no, that's absolutely right.
Please.
And another thing to add, I guess, was all the data that we were collecting needed to actually be worked against the baseline. Because to be able to actually make good use of the data we had, we did have to compare it against a baseline that I think we were in discussions with, and we treated that as the first week in February. And again, that was another decision we had to make, that over the course of the last 7 or 8 months, when data has been received from a number of local authorities, we did need to have something that we could actually work against to actually make best use of some of that analysis.
Can you remind us, because on the face of it, the right comparator for November 2020 would be November 2019, but you've gone with, we went with February right at the outset. What was the rationale for that? And is it really a good comparator for the traffic we're seeing on our roads today?
The rationale was that for all the data sets, there wasn't a guarantee that the historic data was available. We had a number of feeds coming in where we didn't have that February baseline. So it didn't factor into, say, the comparisons with the baseline and sort of percentage difference. We'd use it for other analysis, like looking at how hourly profiles are changing, but we couldn't compare that with the baseline. So what we had to say was, I guess there were two factors that played into this. The first was that one of the ultimate users of this data was the DFT road statistics team, and they were sort of saying, well, we're going to use that first week of February, so we're being consistent with that. And the second reason was that was at least a period of time that most of these data sources had available, and it represented a good month before lockdown started, and sort of not even before lockdown started, before the kind of COVID impact began. Because certainly, and again, it was touched upon at the end of the conversation a moment ago, in terms of the two lockdowns, the original one on the 23rd of March and the current one, they are very different to one another, and the way that traffic has behaved, again, when they came into effect, is very different. And I think that's because the first lockdown, by the time the lockdown started on the 23rd of March, traffic was already 30% below where it was normally, and that's because there was already a filtering down of different restrictions, different conditions around what people could and couldn't do. And I think people would start, different employers were starting to say, right, work from home if you can. And you were already seeing the impact before lockdown started. So when the lockdown actually came into effect on the 23rd, the impact was only a sort of 20% drop. And then there was a slight drop, I think, as some people began to realize over the coming weeks what they could and couldn't do. And it declined further to sort of around 70 to 80% below that normal baseline. Whereas this lockdown, what we've seen is traffic was already before it happened, traffic was already only sort of 10% off where it used to be. I'm not saying that the peaks were the same, that the traffic behavior was the same, but in terms of volume, we were already back to just under 10% of sort of the normal level. But when this lockdown hit, there were two things that happened. The first is between the 4th and the 5th of February, there was a 30% drop in traffic, so a bigger drop than the first lockdown. But also there was a small spike in traffic on the 4th, which we assume is lots of people going out and doing all the things that they knew now, because of the first lockdown, they weren't going to be able to do over the coming month or so. So it's I think they're two very different lockdowns. They behaved very differently. People understood with this lockdown what was going to happen, whereas the first lockdown was very much what's going on, what.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, even with the traffic, I think it makes sense for us to have compared the traffic flows against the beginning of February, but we did something consistent with all the data sets we had, and cycling could potentially be something that we would want to be comparing back to a year. So we would want to be comparing March 2020 to March 2019, just because we know obviously that weather does play a really major part in cycling use. I mean, during the summer months, certainly during that first lockdown period, we were amazed actually about how the increase in cycling usage, even for that time of the year. And now that we're going towards those winter months where, the days are shorter, it's obviously wetter and colder, we have started to see that drop. So ideally, I think from a baseline with cycling, we probably would, moving forward, want to be trying to compare it like a year back, which hopefully soon we might be able to do with the amount of data we've saved up.
Well, I'm guessing, I mean, since you started doing this back in, I suppose it was April, really, when you got going, we're not far off next April. We might well be in a position to do an annual months-on-months comparison. But you raise a really interesting point there, Yusuf, about the difference between how much traffic there is on the road and how many trips people are making. My very parochial observation from where I live is that a lot of people had had enough of having their children in the house, and they would get their bicycles out and they would go on a round trip, which I think in transport terms is what we might call an A to A, which I don't really think of as transport. That's not A to B. How hard have you found it to interpret the data that you're collating here in a way that would enable the folks in the policy world to understand not just volumes of traffic at particular times, but think about what that traffic might be, what might be causing the traffic to have those sorts of patterns? Is that something that we could discern from your analysis?
Definitely. I mean, we've been doing quite a bit of analysis. So some of the insights we're showing in some of our TTF reports, and obviously we're looking at traffic on a day-to-day basis, which can obviously show how it's increasing and decreasing. But we're also looking at the time of the day and trying to compare that. And one of the useful insights we've seen is the morning peak has disappeared for quite a majority of local areas, and that I think is very much down to the fact that a lot of people are working from home. And I think some of those insights that we're trying to gather from an hourly basis can hopefully start answering some of those questions. We've also started collecting some parking data as one of the other attributes, and I think that really helps complement some of the traffic data we have, because it's not just so much a matter of like how much traffic there is on the roads, but where are actually people traveling to and from, and what are their purposes? Because with some of the parking data we have, we can actually classify that as to whether they're using it for retail, supermarkets, whether it's for work, whether it's for travel. So some of those insights, I think, will really help complement those questions about where and why people are traveling. But yeah, there's such a large amount of data. We certainly want to be digging deeper into it.
One of the things,
good,
sorry, yeah, Graham.
It's a good question, because going back to sort of the lockdown 1 versus lockdown 2, what we've seen is with lockdown 1, obviously schools closed, so we knew that the sort of school run wasn't occurring. And so what we've seen with lockdown 2, because schools are open, is the traffic volumes sort of across all the data have dropped to the same level they were at when schools opened back in June. So we can kind of make the assessment that the traffic flow we're seeing right now is predominantly due to the, most of those journeys are going to be down to the school run. And we can sort of say this is the impact that opening schools has had. The other thing I was going to say as well is you sort of mentioned understanding the purpose of the trip. And I think because we can't identify an actual vehicle, we haven't got sort of ANPR data here. Well, we do have actually some, but we don't have any of the sort of number plates behind them, obviously for sensitivity purposes. We can't track if we're picking up the same vehicle going in 2 directions. So again, when schools were closed, what impact does it have that actually one person drives through a loop going one way to the school, then drives past it again in the other direction, going to the station or going somewhere else to do their commute or going to the office? So actually trying to understand those impacts is a bit harder because we can't identify individual trips. We can always only look at the flow, the actual total traffic flow. So yeah, it's quite challenging to delve into that level of detail.
Always difficult. I've got one more thing that I wanted to pick up specifically with you guys have done the number crunching, as it were. So one of the things that I learnt to my cost, I would say, over my years working in transport is that averages, by and large, are completely useless. Average numbers of things mask often what's really happening, which is too extreme. So average traffic doesn't tell you about morning and evening peaks. And Yusuf, you said the morning peak just went away, but I'm just wondering, it went away everywhere, or it went away in some places, but when you tot everything up and produce an average, it's disappeared. But actually, if you tease that apart, you might find different places that have a very different experience. And when we've heard from you, I'm going to come to Sean on that one, because I want to hear, down at the grassroots level of managing an individual authority, have the peaks gone or not? So, but analytically, are these averages helping us, or are they masking some important detail?
I think, just feel that a sec. So I think it's a very good point. And one of the things we want to really focus on with this is that the real benefit I think we're seeing is that we can look at a sort of overall level. I'm not going to call it national because it's not all the local authorities, but overall across all the data sets, we can say this is how much an average it's gone up and down. But actually, when we look at this data at the local level, that's when we start to see, I think, get the real value from the data, because not all these local authorities behave in the same way. It comes down to, in the first place, what's the public transport network like? Do you have good park and ride services? Do people tend to commute by bicycle? Oxford and Cambridge, for example, cycling levels completely the opposite to what we saw elsewhere. Oxford and Cambridge, huge drops in cycling levels because most people cycle on a daily basis anyway. So they weren't going to work, they weren't going to university, and again, different behaviour. So at a local level, you see these different patterns, and it's all based on the local environment and the local services available. And that's why, yeah, in terms of Sean's sort of viewpoint, York might look very different to this sort of overall picture, because it's the overall can give us a decent idea of what's happening, but we really, to understand it properly, you need to look at the local level.
So, Sean, at the local level, you're feeding data up so that people in, well, I used to call it Whitehall, people in their bedroom or in their man cave can have some sense of what's happening at an aggregate level. But meantime, you're there wondering what on earth is happening in and around the city of York. How far did you feel that national picture that the TTF was publishing would give a fair and reasonable picture to your elected members? Or was that something you would say, that's a national picture, but what you need to understand is where we are in comparison to that, because it's not necessarily the same?
Yeah, so as you're saying, it's like comparing apples to oranges. On a national level, it did tend to flow with the same as York. We had obviously some local issues. Our park and rides were closed, for instance, so we had more vehicle travel coming into town for work who were still working, and they didn't have access to the park and ride. We had an increase in cycling, but again, we couldn't determine if that was due to people cycling for work or cycling for lockdown reasons. It might have been more pleasure than anything else. But on comparison, I feel there was a good comparison with the national average overall, if that if that answers your question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it did strike me looking at the figures in the run up to the end of the summer school term, and then from the start of September. I felt what I was seeing was office workers driving their kids to school and driving home again.
Yeah,
Would that be a fair conclusion from what I was seeing?
Yeah, I would say that was a fair conclusion as well. When obviously the schools were all closed, we saw large reduction. Now the schools have come back. People are still doing their school runs and then driving home and working from home. So you're not seeing the onward journeys from A, B to C. You're seeing A, B, A again. So
I'm going to come back shortly to some of the things we might be able to learn looking ahead from all of the work that's been done since the beginning of April here. But I'm going to come to Darren next, because one of the things that most interested me sitting outside the policy environment for a moment is that I was seeing data produced by Highways England over here. I was seeing I think it was the Wednesday morning data being published by the Department of Transport stats team, which was very much an aggregate picture. I was seeing the TTF. I was seeing some data from Vivacity. Darren, you were sitting there, hopefully near the centre of all this, watching it all come together into a coherent picture for ministers. Did it?
Did it? Yes, I think it did eventually. I think we have to remember that what government really wanted out of this TTF data, what we still want, is we see this as one of a number of temperature gauges on the dashboard. And actually, as things change, as we implement lockdowns and change policy, we want to see how that temperature gauge moves. We want to see nationally what happens. And it's the kind of opposite of what Sean's been describing. We do want to see nationally what happened. And I think the trick is to understand what the data is telling you about the big picture. And there is no single source of data. There is no single line on the graph. There is no single temperature gauge which will tell you what's happening out there. So what we were able to do, we were able to put this data that we get from the TTF into a very specific place, which is about understanding travel in cities, understanding travel that's by non-motorized means. So the cycling and walking data was extremely useful. The parking data, again, told us something about the way that cities were behaving that you can't get from our traditional data sources. Extremely useful. The data that we got through Vivacity and the ability to do some quite clever things around generating an index of social distancing, again, was very useful. But these often were useful for different parts of government. So the data that goes to Cabinet Office and then to number 10 is quite simplistic. You know, that does need to be one line on a graph that tells you something quite simple, quite basic about what's happening in the country. Other parts of DFT are interested in the detail, interested in particularly what's happening. So we've been able to produce data that's useful to different parts of the organisation. We've been able to link the data that we're producing to people worried about freight travelling through ports and how that was being affected by COVID. We've been able to link the data that we're producing to people thinking, particularly people working with SAGE, thinking particularly about social distancing. So we've been able to fit this data into a number of different pigeonholes in terms of the data we've had, and in most of these cases, these were pigeonholes that had nothing in them before. And I think one of the rigors that we went through, and this is something that Youssef and Graham will attest to, is we put this data in as we were generating in front of our stats teams, and we said we want to produce this data in a way that meets the statistical requirements of DFT, and that at the time was a pain. That gave us some fairly high hurdles to clear in terms of statistical quality, in terms of the accuracy and the provenance of our data. But having done that means that the data has now been accepted within the DFT as a credible source, as one of the number of sources we have in our armory. and in doing that, we will secure its future, because it isn't, we're able to get beyond the point of saying, well, this was a great use for COVID. Once COVID's over, we don't need it anymore, because we now know that people in the department, for various policy reasons, are depending on this as a new credible source of data that we've never had before.
So I'm going to come back to that in a sec, but I wanted to go to Andy and just muse on the fact that you and I, Andy, have been looking at the world of the connected vehicle recently, and the fact that there's a vast amount of data, even beyond the data that Graham and Yusuf have been manipulating for you over the last 8 or 9 months or so. Do you think there are more data sources that TTF could be tapping into, or TTF, perhaps the role of TTF here is to flag their existence and to open up the thinking on what they might be able to provide, so that folks like Sean and Darren could produce an even better picture of what's going on, but more to the point, produce better responses to what's going on to shape it in a better way. Is that an option for the TTF looking ahead?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Darren's alluded to it. We did some work using data from INRIX to look at the impact on freight traffic going into out of, I think it was 8 different ports, because that's obviously got origin and destination and movements. And it was interesting to see that when the tachograph rules were relaxed, the trip's length went up, as you'd expect. So, you know, as Graham said, it's useful to know not necessarily about the individual vehicle and all that kind of privacy stuff, but origins and destinations, journey times, delays at signals and so on. So we're starting to use that in a number of projects, one of which is with York. We're using individual vehicle data there. And I'd like to think it's not just car data, and as you know, my mantra of it's not just about connected new cars, but old things as well. And particularly cycles, because starting to see Strava as a source of data that can be used, but a bit worried that may not be very representative. So absolutely, I think that now we've got a good statistical baseline of volume, because that's what everybody knows and understands. Start doing some exciting stuff with in-vehicle data. We mentioned the Vivacity sensors, which were cameras repurposed for doing things such as measuring social distancing. So I think the whole idea is not one size fits all, not one single tool, but some good long-standing baseline volume data, some good in-vehicle data to look at changes. You know, things like freight. I don't know if you noticed, Steve, but Brexit hasn't really gone away, and there might be some use for things like monitoring ports and so on coming up in the next few months. But also the thing I would really say is that we need to get our head around some of the things about how we use individual vehicle data in terms of things like perceived privacy problems, perceived costs, this, that, and the other. Because, you know, where you have installed a fixed sensor for the last 20 years, which is a really good place to measure trips in and out of your city, may not now be a good place because the travel patterns have changed, because the employment has gone, or leisure has moved, or whatever. So flexibility that I think connected vehicles gives us, allied with that good solid statistical baseline that infrastructure gives us.
Okay.
Let's make a point
Graham.
there as well, certainly around some connected vehicles and the data we might get from them. I think another thing this project has again reinforced is that the use of data standards is extremely important, because if these sorts of data sets are going to be used in this way, it's going to be far more easier to use them if they're all coming in the same standard.
Absolutely.
I want to turn to, well, I guess there are two things this data, once pulled together, could be helping us answer. So it felt to me, particularly in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, the lockdown part 1, that what the data was telling me was, sort of as a citizen, with those famous graphs that appeared on the daily briefings, was yes, we are locked down. People are staying at home. And I think the message was, look, the traffic's gone down. Everybody's doing this. It's your job to do the same. Don't go out on frivolous trips. Stay at home. It was very much reinforcing the government message at the time. But I'm left wondering, as time has ticked on, and I'm looking to Darren and Sean again here, whether there's a so what question coming. okay, we've tracked the traffic, we've got a good idea, this is what's been happening. But if I was the roads minister, if I was one of your elected members, Sean, I might be saying, so what? What am I supposed to do with this? Am I going to react to it? Is there something you're inviting me to do or do differently that I wouldn't otherwise have done? Are we able, either of you, to say, actually, this wouldn't have happened if we hadn't known, or we wouldn't have been able to take these decisions? Have things happen? Let's start with you, Sean. At the local level, were there things that you did, that your local authority did, that it only did because it was able to understand better what was really going on?
Yeah, so simple things like maintenance. Being able to get out on the road in highly congested areas is very difficult. We were able to show that the traffic in that area is going to be lower. We can get out there, get the work done, and it improves it for when traffic levels get back to normal. That is one of the major things we found from this. We could get work done. It wouldn't disrupt people's lives because we're already disrupted. We're already sat at home. And when we get back to normal, people can go about their day without as much traffic disruption.
That's a great example. Yeah, I mean, that's spot on. I can't begin to tell you how many sets of cones erupted around where I live for a variety of reasons. It felt like spring had come. But Darren, at the national level, can you point to things that you think got decided within the DFT on the basis of this?
I think it's more difficult at a national level. I think it's certainly the case that, as I say, the data was a temperature gauge that allowed us to understand what was happening, and I think that was its particular use. I think at a national level, its use is longer term. So I'm not someone that really ascribes to the view that COVID will change the world forever and we'll live in some new world after this has all gone away. I think we will spring back to the way we used to be, but not completely. I think there will be changes. And I think as DFT grapples with how COVID fundamentally affects the way that we live aspects of our life, particularly commuting, I think this data will be increasingly useful for that. And I think at a shorter time frame, I think government has been reacting to what needed to be done to suppress the virus, and that's been the key. The data has been useful to help confirm what we did and how it was impacting society. For DFT, it's a longer game. It's how do we use the road network as we come out of this? How does that change? How do we think about a network that for in many cities is primarily configured around managing capacity in the 2 peak hours? Well, if that's not the way things are going in the future, what does that look like? How does that change? How do we manage the fact that we've very quickly introduced legislation around e-scooters and bringing micro-mobility to the streets of the UK, which we intended to trial over the next few years, and we've actually done very quickly. We actually have trials running now. How will that affect the mix of traffic and the mix of vehicle use in cities? Well, previously, we would have very little data to prove that. Now we do have a data source to help us prove that. And I think this is the key for DFT, is we realise there will be some new, novel and different policy interventions coming in the next few years, and this data is a vital source of data for dealing with that. And I think just the final point to make is the B word that Andy raised a few minutes ago. Brexit is coming. Now, particularly in port cities and areas where we have high amounts of freight and distribution, we will need that same temperature gauge that we used for COVID to tell us what's happening. How is the country reacting to whatever our exit from the EU looks like? And again, this data is increasingly being looked at as one of the sources, one of the number of temperature gauges that DFT has to look at as it tries to plan a way through that.
Absolutely. I just wanted to add on there. I mean, that concept of what normal is and what normal is going to look like in future, because we may not get back to the normal levels of traffic we had before, for all the reasons that Darren has just mentioned around, changes in working patterns, the way where people work, when people travel. And I think we've got, obviously, there's a lot of intelligent mobility type strategies and themes out there at the moment. Mobility as a service, the concept that a driverless car is going to come pick you up and car ownership will decline. Is that still going to be the case? Are people still going to trust that type of service, or will we see again the rise in private car ownership that we weren't, I guess, really expecting to happen? And I mean, you look at the news today, the kind of story around all those black cabs being stored in fields and warehouses in London because demand has gone down. Is that demand going to come back? Are people going to still be using private hire and sort of public taxis in the same way they were before? So I think there's a lot of questions, and this is where this data is really going to help answer those going forwards.
Well, this is one of the things that I'm gonna come back to Darren in a moment, again, and perhaps Sean, on that policy question, because I think there's a difference between, is the traffic, in the broader sense, is the traffic going to come back, and do you want it to come back? Because from where I'm sitting, again, outside the policy mainstream these days, I'm seeing rather disjointed, cognitive dissonance, I'm going to call it. That on the one hand, we want the economy to thrive. We want cities like the city of York to be successful places where people want to be and people want to live and businesses are thriving. But for, I would say, probably the majority of my working life in the Department of Transport, going back to the mid-1980s, we were trying to reduce the need to travel. And all of a sudden, we have reduced the need to travel. So why on earth would we want the traffic to come back? So that's one of the policy conundrum that I'd be interested in hearing from Sean and Darren, and whether that's coming through from your policy colleagues. But before we do that, Graham and Youssef, you've got the data that you've got, obviously. Darren's saying, you know, we've got a foundation there. We're going to carry on with those data sources, which is great. But in the unlikely event that I had a fairy wand and could grant you your wishes, what extra data would you really, really like to get your hands on? What would make this analysis sing even more clearly and tell us what's really going on? And is it data that, but for the sake of asking, we could have? Or is it like the transport planner's dream? It's all about origin and destination, and GDPR's put pay to that. So what would you like? Youssef, you get to go first on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I won't go to the most obvious one, obviously, which is we would like more data from more local authorities and get a much richer picture of what's going on from the national perspective. I mean, there's two key points I kind of wanted to mention. I guess the first is one thing we've noticed with some of the analysis was right in the beginning, we were looking very much at the national picture. We were looking at it just as a broad what's going on in England. But we've definitely found out now, with so many different factors happening, with schools reopening, people working from home, and just some of the restrictions which are local and so forth, we have found out that actually understanding things at a local level is actually much more important. So getting a bit more of that richer data, I think, would really help. Which we could talk about more in detail. But I think the second thing I would really like to start thinking about is actually, with people's behavior. People don't just travel by car. People do use, to an extent, some of the mobility as a service. Some people do drive to a station and then get onto the trains and so forth. A way for us to try and see how we can actually utilize that data and actually understand how we can actually sync the different types of transport that are being used and actually start trying to make some insights into that and trying to understand. We've noticed, obviously, the government have really tried to reduce the need for public transport, and that as a result has increased to an extent some of the car usage we've seen. But if we're able to actually make a clear link between the two, I think some of that would be very useful. Graham, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big loaded question. There's a lot we could request, but I mean, certainly the obvious one, UK-wide coverage, integration of all the national data sets for the national network. I mean, fundamentally, origin, destination, purpose of journey, why are people traveling, where are they going, different modes. So getting public transport data in there. Can we start to look at the patterns between both road traffic and obviously rail, tram, light rail, whatever. And I should say that actually, we'll name drop anyway. So Nottingham, for example, were great. They gave us tram data. They gave us lots of other different modes. But because they were the only one, for the most part, we were obviously just taking the road data. But certainly things like vehicle class. So again, things that relate to just consistent data quality and more detailed data from the existing sensor network or the existing points. Just things like getting vehicle class data for the whole network would be a huge improvement. So there's lots of things we could add to that list, but I'm just, I guess, spitballing the things that I can think of now.
Fair enough. I wasn't expecting a definitive answer. I was just trying to think beyond we just want more, where we might start to look for that more. But Youssef, you raise a very important point there, which again I'm going to put to Sean and then to Darren, which is we've talked a bit about having plentiful sources of data that relates to traffic volume, traffic flow, traffic makeup, whether it's cars, vans, trucks or bicycles. But what about public transport? Where does that feature in this? Were you able to bring together a richer picture of people's travel patterns? Because again, what I saw at certainly the early part of lockdown was we might have seen a dramatic fall in road traffic. It was as nothing to the collapse of rail traffic. It was as nothing to the collapse of bus usage. And I think at a national level, I think we're seeing bus patronage had crept up before the second lockdown to somewhere between 40 and 60%, depending on where you are. Rail still somewhat lagging behind. So were you able at a local level, Sean, and were you at a national level, Darren, able to bring together the road-related data and the public transport data so people could answer questions that are more about, are people going to work? Are people making leisure trips? Sean, what's the picture in York?
So locally, obviously, our bus company is run by First York. They provided passenger data to our teams, and then obviously similar to Graham and Yusuf, they compared the data and passed that on to our elected officials. Obviously, as you say, there was a massive drop in bus patronage. We took the decision to close the park and rides. One has become a test centre, so that was a big loss in bus patronage, and then it slowly went down. As you say, it started to increase again over the unlockdown period to roughly around 45-50%, but again that has dropped again due to second lockdown. It's really difficult to determine what's going to happen with bus passengers at this time. We expect it to increase again, but while the park and rides are closed, we don't see that happening quite as quickly as we'd like.
And Darren, were the numbers coming together at the Department for Transport? Was somebody pulling this comprehensive picture together across the modes?
Yes, absolutely. And in a way, this was an area where roads transport was traditionally the kind of poor relation, in that we do get quite comprehensive rail data. We get that through the franchising arrangements, or we didn't until they stopped working, but we still do. We get that data for rail use. We get increasing amounts of data from the bus network. So we've always had that to some degree, and we are now getting more of that through the Bus Open Data service that we've recently launched. So we were always getting quite good and probably better data about public transport than we were about road use. And go back to the point I made earlier about going through the rigors of having the data that we were producing approved and agreed by our statisticians means that data can now form part of that. So there are people in other parts of the building, obviously the virtual building at the moment, but there are people in other parts of the building that are now able to bring that local authority city road data into that same place. I think it's worth saying that probably in the 34 years I've now worked in local authority transport, probably the single most monumental thing I've ever heard was a Prime Minister standing up and imploring people to not use buses and trains, which I think after the decades of promoting those modes as an alternative to the car, to do that was incredibly necessary, but will take a huge amount of time and effort to row back from. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing a lot of, I suspect we're seeing some of the growth in car traffic that we're seeing, certainly up to the latest lockdown, was people not using public transport who traditionally would have done. And I think as a department, as a government, as a country, we have a massive challenge ahead to get people back onto public transport again, to make those modes sustainable again, and to get them to play the part they were playing in urban transport. Having all this data in one place and increasingly getting more of that data into one place will be absolutely fundamental in how we plot a way through that, how we develop policies to see that happen again.
Graham, thanks, Darren. So Graham, I'm going to come to you in a sec because I can see in the chat we've got a lot of questions in from Lyndon, and I'd like to get your chop on those. But before I do, I'm going to turn to Andy here because it really goes to the heart of what the Transport Technology Forum is about for me. That we're trying to bring together the people who could sell advanced traffic solutions to people who are wrestling with familiar traffic problems. I think Darren and Sean have both referenced the morning peak. You know, we've spent our entire transport careers trying to cope with the fact that we have peaks and then we have troughs, and how on earth do you get the right capacity when you're wrestling with that sort of world? Do you think there's a role for the TTF in helping us not just to think what are the clever solutions, but also have the problems changed as well? Is that something that needs to come out in the dialogue between the local authority customers like Sean and Darren in his former before Whitehall life, and the supply side?
Absolutely, because you know what we've not really gone into is in the change in mix-up. So you've got loads of people, white vans, but also just private cars doing internet deliveries. And all that stuff has to be trunked around, so that's heavy vehicles. So we're getting a change in the timing of the peaks, we're getting a change in the vehicles that are involved, we're getting a changing in origin destinations. Now, everything we know to be true, everything that we've spent 34 years in Darren's case working on, designing around the morning peak, some of the graphs that are in the TTF report we're looking at, you look at it and struggle and you think, well, there's not really much of a peak anymore anywhere. And certainly lockdown, on those days when, to be honest, you didn't know what day of the week it was, you couldn't tell from the traffic data what day of the week it was either. So I think there's something very much about flexibility to change in travel, you know, whether mobility as a service catches on in terms of sharing something, sharing a vehicle with people in the future when we've got social distancing, I don't know. So I think TTF can bring, highlighting the new technology solutions, highlighting the needs of local authorities to know stuff, the national picture of bringing it all together. You know, I, for the first time in my career, could explain to people what I do. I could say, you know, that graph that's on at 5 o'clock of traffic, I do that stuff. And people thought, oh, well, long last we know what you do, Mr. Graham. But I think that whole point about awareness that data is going to become everything and we can be a focus for how to get that. And as Graham says, it's got to be in standard ways, not the multitude of things that we've got. It's got to be from all types of different vehicles of all types. And I think the final thing that TTF can do is actually really focus on the practitioners, the Sean's and his colleagues around the country, because they deal with day-to-day problems and not perhaps so much some of the, to use a phrase from Mr. Cape's self-driving nuclear-powered space hopper stuff and self-piloted hovercraft, but actually focus on the day-to-day stuff and how we can help them move forward across the country.
Okay, well, that's a good thought. And so those of us involved in thinking about topics for the TTF to engage in for our future forums, maybe putting a spotlight on how the questions and challenges that local authorities have and are facing are changing as a consequence, both of what we've seen through lockdown and, of course, through the big announcements we've seen at the start of this week about the government's green industrial revolution. So that's a good one. The last time I was able to explain my job to anyone, it was that I was a private secretary and therefore I was Bernard in Yes Minister, which was the only time I think my father ever understood what I was doing for a living. I'm going to skip lightly over that. I'm going to ask Graham for a quick reaction to the questions that Lyndon has been posting there particularly. And we will follow up. If other people have got questions, there is a chance to post them for us and we will try and come back to you. But after Graham, we are into the last 5 minutes. So short answer from Graham, and then I'm just going to go around the screen for one thought from each person here. One thought, what's the last 7 months of collecting, analyzing, producing this data? What's the one thought that it brings to your mind that you'd like to share with the people who are watching this video conference? But Graham, first on the Q&As.
First of all, I hope your friends are more forgiving than mine, Andy, who now think that I make PowerPoint slides for a living. But I was going to say, maybe not in terms of answering the questions directly, but I think there's certainly a few questions here around sort of future of this service, and we've covered some of them in terms of increasing the scope, increasing the scale. I think there's certainly, I'm sure Darren has a view on this too, but I think there's certainly an interest in terms of gathering more data, but certainly going forwards, the last 7 months and the kind of requirement for this service in the first place was all around speed, trying to get that view of the network as quickly as possible in as easier, shall we say, way as we could possibly do it. I think going forwards, there is probably a desire to say, right, we've got a number of local authorities who have been helping us for the last 7 months by sending us data in CSV file format. That's not really sustainable as a long-term option. So I think there's certainly a question around how can we work with local authorities? How can we help them make that data available more easier? How can we help them understand sometimes what they have? How can we help them open that up? And there's also maybe a question about working with some of the suppliers who have obviously host some of that data and make it available at the moment. That's certainly one. So I think questions in here around how can I share my data? I think that's certainly something that long term there might be changes to the way that's done. And certainly I think that idea that a lot of local authorities have been giving us data, a lot of suppliers have been giving us data, how do we give the value back? So there's a lot of data here that's being used by, for the different purposes we've talked about, but how can we give the value of that data and the benefits of that data back to the local authority sharing it with us? So one thing I didn't really touch upon at all was, along with the TTF reports, we developed a suite of Power BI dashboards very quickly that showed the data in lots of different ways, different aggregations, across across the months, across sort of hourly profiles, and all of that information is probably of use to the people who are sharing it with us. So again, how can we now get the value back to the people giving us data? So I think they're two key things to look at going forwards.
Graham, thank you for that. And cheekily, exercising my iron controller's chair, I'm going to decide that how can we give something back is your thought that you're going to take away from the last 7 months. I'm going to go in the order I can see people on screen, which is going to be Andy, Sean and Darren next. So Andy, your quick thought for the last 7 months.
Just what a great bunch of people work in transport in the UK that can rise to Darren Churchill Capes' challenge, work stupid amounts of hours, put a lot of effort in, particularly on the Arab side, to produce something I think we'll be very proud of. How do we do more of it?
Nice. Sean?
Yeah, that was quite hard to follow, actually. I was going to say something like, should people think more of if that journey is actually necessary? Because we have seen during this lockdown that traffic levels have dropped and people are still getting on with their day, even though you're locked in and you can get on with your day. You do not need to take that car. It helps everybody. It doesn't just help me and my job, it helps everybody.
You remind me of the time the British ambassador was asked by a radio station what he wanted for Christmas, and he asked for a bottle of champagne, and then he discovered that the French ambassador had asked for world peace. Darren, then Youssef, and then we're going to wind up. Darren.
I think people like Sean and people doing his sort of job in local authorities are very...
Darren has frozen on my screen. We're going to come to Youssef.
Yes, I actually just suffered from an internet connection issue myself, so I don't know what everyone else answered, but hopefully that gives me a fresh start. But I think one of the interesting insights I've seen every week, Andy, Graham, myself, and Darren and Paul have discussions just before we send our weekly digest, and we have a quick discussion about some of the what we'd seen in the previous week. And I think what's been really interesting is every single week we can't predict what's going to happen next week.
Right.
So we continue to say, okay, schools are going to reopen. We're expecting to see this change, and lo and behold, it's not exactly what we suspected. And I think that's what's been really interesting over the course of the even 8 or 9 months. We still can't guess really what's going to happen. So I think the data we've found has been very useful. We've obviously been really grateful for all the data that a lot of local authorities have been sharing with us, and it just keeps, I guess, the work that we're doing keeps it really interesting. And I think that's what's certainly my thoughts.
Excellent. Interesting. That's useful. We need to wind up. Sorry, Darren, we would have had your thought there, but I'm going to tell you what your thought is, which is, isn't it brilliant to get an ITS award? So well done, guys.
Absolutely.
I played no part in that myself, I can take no credit for it, apart from the fact that obviously I'm putting it on my CV because I'm the chair of the TTF, so why wouldn't I? But anyway, well done for all the hard work. Some great thoughts there, and particularly some great thoughts about where we might take the TTF looking ahead. All we know about the future is it hasn't happened yet. It's going to be a challenging time for all of us, but the more we know about what's going on, the better informed we're going to be in the decisions we take. That's my strap line, and I'd just like to thank everyone who's taken part today, everyone who's been in on the call, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next TTF Fireside Chat in the future. Thanks very much.